The waves crashed against the steel hulls with unrelenting fury as Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder gripped the rail of his landing craft, his knuckles white against the metal. It was the early hours of June 6, 1944, and the English Channel had become a tempest of salt spray and anxiety. Around him, 150,000 Allied soldiers prepared for what would become the largest seaborne invasion in military history. General Dwight David Eisenhower had made the most consequential decision of the war just hours before. The weather forecast showed a brief window of opportunity amid the storms that had been battering the Channel for days. Operation Overlord, the code name for the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, would proceed despite conditions that seemed to favor the defenders rather than the attackers. Across the dark waters, the German Atlantic Wall stretched along the French coastline like a concrete serpent. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had spent months strengthening these defenses. Massive gun emplacements, intricate minefields, and deadly obstacles transformed the beaches into what seemed an impregnable fortress. The Germans had been expecting an invasion, but they believed it would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. Captain Frank Lillyman of the 101st Airborne Division checked his parachute one final time as his C-47 transport aircraft droned through the darkness toward the Normandy Peninsula. Behind him, 13,000 paratroopers prepared to jump behind enemy lines, their mission critical to the success of the entire operation. These men would secure vital bridges, disrupt German communications, and create chaos in the enemy's rear areas. Meanwhile, 6,000 ships of the Allied Armada pressed forward through the churning seas. Battleships like HMS Warspite and USS Nevada prepared to unleash devastating barrages against coastal fortifications. The logistical magnitude was staggering. This invasion force represented the combined industrial might of Britain, America, Canada, and the Free French forces. In his bunker overlooking Omaha Beach, Obergefreiter Franz Gockel of the 352nd Infantry Division peered through the pre-dawn gloom. Something felt different about this night. The usual Allied reconnaissance flights seemed more numerous, and there were reports of increased radio chatter. Still, his commanders assured him that no invasion could succeed in such weather. According to historical accounts documented by the Imperial War Museum, the deception operation known as Fortitude had been masterfully executed. Phantom armies under General George Patton's apparent command threatened Calais, while the real invasion force approached Normandy undetected. The Germans had positioned their strongest reserves, including several panzer divisions, far from where they would actually be needed. As dawn approached, the first Pathfinder aircraft crossed the French coast. Below, sleeping villages had no idea they were about to witness history's greatest amphibious assault. The fate of Western civilization hung in the balance as thousands of young men, many barely out of their teens, prepared to storm the beaches that would determine whether Hitler's thousand-year Reich would continue its grip on Europe or finally begin to crumble under the weight of Allied determination. The roar of aircraft engines shattered the pre-dawn silence over the Cotentin Peninsula as the greatest airborne operation in military history commenced. At 1:15 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the first Pathfinder teams of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began their descent into occupied France. Major Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, felt his stomach lurch as his C-47 banked sharply to avoid German flak. The aircraft carrying the paratroopers flew through, a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire that lit up the Norman sky like a deadly fireworks display. Many planes were hit, some crashed, and others veered off course, scattering their precious human cargo across miles of unfamiliar terrain. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself in a nightmarish situation that would become legendary. His parachute caught on the church tower in Sainte-Mère-Église, leaving him dangling helplessly as German soldiers fought American paratroopers in the streets below. For hours, he played dead while the battle raged around him, watching his comrades fight house to house against determined German defenders. The mission objectives were ambitious beyond imagination. The airborne forces had to secure the western flank of the invasion beaches, capture vital bridges over the Douve and Murderette rivers, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coastal defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole led his 3rd Battalion through the flooded fields behind Utah Beach, where the Germans had deliberately breached dikes to create treacherous marshlands. Glider operations added another dimension to the aerial assault. These silent aircraft, towed across the Channel and released over Normandy, carried everything from light artillery to jeeps and medical supplies. Major General Richard Gale commanded the British 6th Airborne Division, whose mission included capturing the crucial Pegasus Bridge over the Caen Canal. The success of this operation would prevent German armor from counterattacking the eastern beaches. In the darkness, confusion reigned supreme. Many paratroopers landed miles from their designated drop zones, scattered across the Norman countryside like seeds in a windstorm. Small groups of soldiers, often from different units, banded together and improvised their way toward their objectives. The distinctive click-clack sound of cricket toys became the recognition signal that helped scattered Americans identify friend from foe in the darkness. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself virtually alone when he landed in a field near Messières. Rather than wait for reinforcements, he single-handedly attacked a German barracks complex, moving from building to building with methodical precision. His one-man war would later be recognized as one of the most extraordinary individual actions of D-Day. The German response was hampered by confusion and poor communication. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, was one of the first senior German officers to realize that this was the long-awaited invasion, not merely a diversion. However, many of his superiors, including Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, remained convinced that the main assault would still come at Calais. As reported in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive study, D-Day, the airborne operations, despite their scattered nature, achieved something perhaps more valuable than their specific tactical objectives. They created confusion and panic throughout the German command structure. Reports of paratroopers landing everywhere from Carentan to Caen convinced German commanders that they faced a much larger airborne assault than actually existed. By dawn, approximately 20,000 Allied airborne troops had landed in Normandy, though many were still trying to find their units and objectives. The stage was now set for the seaborne assault, as the sound of naval gunfire began to thunder across the Norman coast. At 5:50 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the horizon erupted in flame and thunder as the greatest naval bombardment in history commenced. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay commanded a fleet that stretched beyond the visual horizon, 6,000 vessels of every description, from massive battleships to tiny landing craft, all converging on the Normandy coast. The battleship HMS Warspite, a veteran of the Battle of Jutland in the First World War, opened fire with her 15-inch guns, sending shells the weight of small automobiles screaming toward German coastal batteries. Alongside her, USS Nevada, herself a survivor of Pearl Harbor, added her voice to the devastating chorus. The sound was so tremendous that windows shattered in houses miles inland, and the concussion waves could be felt in the stomachs of soldiers still aboard their landing craft. Captain Joseph Dawson of the 1st Infantry Division watched in awe as the bombardment transformed the Norman coastline into an inferno of smoke and flame. Behind him, his men of the 16th Infantry Regiment prepared for their assault on Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of the 5 landing zones. The naval gunfire was supposed to neutralize the German defenses, but intelligence had underestimated the strength and sophistication of the coastal fortifications. Oberst Johannes Ocker, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment defending Omaha Beach, had his men well positioned in reinforced concrete bunkers that could withstand all but direct hits from the largest naval guns. His artillery was expertly sighted to create interlocking fields of fire across the beach approaches. Despite the thunderous bombardment raining down around them, many of these positions remained operational. The landing craft pushed through increasingly rough seas toward their assigned beaches. Seasickness was rampant among the troops, many of whom had been aboard ship for days. Lieutenant Robert Edlin of the 2nd Ranger Battalion noticed that some of his men were so violently ill that they could barely stand. Yet they still checked their weapons and prepared for battle with grim determination. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division, under Major General Douglas Graham, prepared to assault German positions held by the 716th Infantry Division. The Royal Navy's bombardment had been more effective here, and the German defenses, while formidable, were not as concentrated as those facing the Americans at Omaha Beach. Colonel James Van Fleet's 8th Infantry Regiment approached Utah Beach, where the landing would prove to be the most successful of the day. The airborne operations had helped secure the exits from this beach, and Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, would famously declare upon landing in the wrong sector, "We'll start the war from right here." The German coastal artillery began to respond to the invasion fleet. The battery at Longues-sur-Mer engaged HMS Ajax in a duel that would rage for hours. Other batteries targeted the landing craft as they approached the beaches, sending geysers of water skyward as shells bracketed the small boats packed with nervous soldiers. Destroyer captains demonstrated extraordinary courage by bringing their ships dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support. USS McCook and USS Carmick virtually beached themselves to engage German strongpoints at point-blank range. These actions would prove crucial in suppressing defensive fire during the critical first hours of the assault. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history, the naval phase of Operation Neptune involved unprecedented coordination between multiple nations' fleets. British, American, Canadian, French, and other Allied naval units worked together with a precision that would have been impossible without years of careful planning and training. As the landing craft approached the surf line, the naval bombardment began to lift and shift inland to avoid hitting friendly forces. The moment of truth was at hand. After years of planning, training, and preparation, the fate of the invasion now rested with the thousands of young men about to storm Hitler's Atlantic Wall. At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the first landing craft ground against the sand of Normandy, and the gates of hell opened upon the beaches. What followed would be remembered as the longest day in military history, as young men from across the Allied nations fought and died to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. Omaha Beach became a slaughterhouse within minutes of the first landings. The 299th Engineer Combat Battalion, tasked with clearing obstacles, found themselves under withering machine, gunfire from the bluffs above. Sergeant Philip Strechik watched in horror as German MG-42 machine guns swept the beach with scientific precision, cutting down entire boatloads of soldiers before they could even reach dry sand. Captain Leonard Schroeder of the 2nd Ranger Battalion led his men across what would become known as Bloody Omaha through a hell of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. The carefully planned timetables collapsed as unit after unit was decimated in the surf. Landing craft became floating morgues as German fire found its mark with deadly accuracy. The German defenders, commanded by General Dietrich Kreis of the 352nd Infantry Division, fought with desperate efficiency. They had trained for this moment for years, and their positions offered perfect fields of fire across the beach approaches. Obergefreiter Heinz Severloh, manning an MG-42 in the WN-72 Strongpoint, would later claim to have fired 12,000 rounds during the course of the morning. At Pointe du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion faced a seemingly impossible mission. They had to scale 100-foot cliffs under fire to silence a German battery that could devastate the landing beaches. Using ropes and grappling hooks, while German defenders rolled grenades down upon them, these Rangers demonstrated courage that defied description. Utah Beach presented a stark contrast to the carnage at Omaha. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., at 56 years old, the oldest man to land on D-Day, personally reconnoitered the beach and made the crucial decision to proceed with the landings despite being in the wrong sector. His calm leadership under fire earned him the Medal of Honor and helped ensure Utah Beach's success. The British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, saw their own fierce fighting. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Rod Keller fought through strong German positions in the seaside villages. The Régiment de la Chaudière and other Canadian units advanced with determination that impressed even their German opponents. Sword Beach witnessed some of the day's most dramatic action as British commandos under Lord Lovat fought to link up with the airborne forces at Pegasus Bridge. The sound of Lovat's bagpiper, Bill Millen, playing Highland Laddie as the commandos advanced, became one of the iconic images of D-Day courage. By mid-morning at Omaha Beach, the situation appeared hopeless. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, seriously considered evacuating the beach and redirecting forces elsewhere. Bodies littered the sand, landing craft burned in the surf, and German fire continued to dominate the killing ground below the bluffs. Then, gradually, small groups of survivors began to move inland. Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion, led by Colonel Max Schneider, found gaps in the German defenses and began infiltrating up the draws. Individual acts of heroism multiplied into collective action as junior officers and non-commissioned officers took charge of scattered groups and led them forward. As documented in historian Max Hastings's detailed account of the battle, the turning point came when destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support. USS McCook and other destroyers engaged German strongpoints at ranges of less than 1,000 yards, their gunfire finally beginning to suppress the deadly defensive fire. By noon, small groups of American infantry had reached the top of the bluffs at Omaha Beach. The Atlantic Wall, seemingly impregnable that morning, had been breached through incredible sacrifice and determination. As the afternoon of June 6, 1944 progressed, the character of the battle shifted from desperate survival to methodical advance. The Allied forces, having gained their bloody footholds on the beaches, now faced the challenge of expanding their narrow beachheads before German reinforcements could mount an effective counterattack. Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment, wounded but refusing evacuation, led his men up the bluffs behind Omaha Beach with his arm in a sling and a cigar clenched between his teeth. His regiment had suffered devastating casualties in the morning assault, but the survivors were now working their way inland, clearing German strongpoints one by one. The German response was hampered by confusion at the highest levels. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced that the weather made invasion impossible. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, was conducting a map exercise in Rennes, and many other senior officers were away from their posts. This absence of command authority delayed crucial decisions about committing the reserve panzer divisions. At Point du Hoc, the Rangers discovered that their costly assault on the 100-foot cliffs had been based on outdated intelligence. The massive guns they had sacrificed so much to silence had been replaced by wooden decoys. However, a patrol led by Sergeant Jack Kuhn found the actual battery hidden inland and destroyed it with thermite grenades, validating their heroic efforts. British forces at Gold Beach made steady progress inland, with the 50th Infantry Division advancing toward Bayeux. The Desert Rats, as they were known from their North African campaigns, adapted quickly from the amphibious assault to traditional infantry tactics. Their experience showed as they methodically reduced German strongpoints and expanded their beachhead. At Sword Beach, the situation became increasingly complex as German armor finally began to respond to the invasion. The 21st Panzer Division under General Major Edgar Feuchtinger launched the only significant German counterattack of D-Day. Their Panzer Mark IVs and assault guns drove toward the coast, briefly reaching the sea between Juno and Sword Beaches before being forced to withdraw by concentrated Allied fire. Major John Howard's glider-borne coup de main force at Pegasus Bridge had accomplished one of the day's most perfect operations. Landing within 50 yards of their objective just after midnight, they had seized the vital bridge intact and held it against increasingly desperate German counterattacks. The arrival of Lord Lovett's commandos in the afternoon finally relieved these exhausted airborne troops. Canadian forces at Juno Beach advanced farther inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day, with elements of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division reaching within sight of the Calm Bayou Highway. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifles fought through the heavily defended coastal villages with exceptional skill and determination. The logistics of supplying the invasion forces began to take shape as engineer units worked frantically to clear beach obstacles and establish supply routes. The artificial harbors, known as mulberries, were still being towed across the channel, but smaller vessels began landing directly on the beaches as soon as areas were secured and cleared of mines. German 15th Army units at Pas-de-Calais remained in position, still convinced by Allied deception operations that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion. This strategic deception, maintained even after D-Day, prevented the commitment of significant German reserves when they might have made a crucial difference. By evening, approximately 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy. The beachheads were narrow and vulnerable, with the deepest penetration reaching only about 6 miles inland. However, the Atlantic Wall had been irreparably breached, and Hitler's fortress Europe was no longer impregnable. Casualty figures varied widely by beach, with Omaha Beach accounting for roughly half of the day's Allied losses. According to official records compiled by the U.S. Army Historical Division, total Allied casualties for D-Day were approximately 10,400 men, far fewer than the 20,000 that had been feared. The success of the landings, bought with courage and blood, had established the Western Front that would ultimately lead to Nazi Germany's defeat. Darkness fell on June 6, 1944. The Allied beachheads flickered like candle flames against the Norman coast. The success of D-Day hung in the balance as German commanders finally grasped the magnitude of the invasion and began rushing reinforcements toward Normandy. The next 24 hours would determine whether the greatest amphibious assault in history would succeed or become a costly failure. General Erwin Rommel raced back from Germany in his staff car, covering the 500 miles to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon in record time. Upon arrival, he immediately grasped what his subordinates had failed to understand throughout the day. This was the main invasion, not a feint. His absence during the critical first hours would haunt him for the remainder of his military career. At his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion until well into the afternoon. His insistence on personal control over the Panzer reserves meant that the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, and Panzer Lehr Division remained immobilized while the Allies consolidated their precarious footholds. By the time authorization came to move these crucial units, precious hours had been lost. The Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day, achieving complete air superiority over the battlefield. German aircraft managed only 319 sorties, and the Luftwaffe's absence was painfully obvious to the defenders. Colonel Joseph Priller's lone Focke-Wulf F-190 strafing run over Sword Beach represented the entirety of German air opposition during the daylight hours. Colonel Russell Reeder of the 12th Infantry Regiment worked to expand the Utah Beach beachhead throughout the night. His men had linked up with elements of the 101st Airborne Division, creating a continuous front that stretched several miles inland. The successful capture of causeway exits across the flooded areas behind the beach had made Utah the most secure of all the landing zones. At Omaha Beach, the situation remained precarious despite the afternoon breakthroughs. General Leonard Jarrow's Fifth Corps had fewer than 3,000 men ashore by nightfall, and German artillery still commanded much of the beach area. However, Rangers and infantry continued to infiltrate the bluff positions, gradually expanding the narrow foothold that had been purchased at such tremendous cost. The British Second Army, under Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, faced the most organized German response. The 21st Panzer Division's counterattack, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated that German armor remained a formidable threat. The failure to capture Caen on D-Day would have long-term consequences for the entire campaign. Naval gunfire support proved crucial throughout the night as German forces probed the Allied positions. The destroyers USS Frankfurt and HMS Warspite engaged German artillery batteries and troop concentrations with deadly accuracy. The psychological impact of naval gunfire on German defenders cannot be overstated. These massive shells arriving without warning demoralized even veteran troops. Brigadier Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, consolidated his commandos' positions around Ouistreham after their successful link-up with the airborne forces. His No. 4 Commando had fought through heavily defended positions to reach Pegasus Bridge, but casualties had been severe. The distinctive green berets of the Royal Marine Commandos were now scattered across miles of Norman countryside. Supply operations continued throughout the night as LSTs and smaller vessels braved German artillery to deliver crucial reinforcements and equipment. The artificial harbors were still en route from England, but innovative beachmasters organized supply operations that would keep the invasion forces fighting through the critical first days. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding German 7th Army, finally began to coordinate an effective response to the invasion. The 352nd Infantry Division was ordered to counterattack at Omaha Beach, while reserve units moved toward all the landing areas. However, Allied air power made daylight movement extremely hazardous for German forces. According to Chester Wilmot's authoritative account, The Struggle for Europe, the German High Command's confusion and delay in responding to the invasion represented one of the war's decisive intelligence failures. The success of Allied deception operations, combined with Hitler's intuitive but incorrect strategic judgment, gave the invasion forces the time they desperately needed to consolidate their positions. By dawn on June 7th, 175,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, along with over 50,000 vehicles. The Atlantic Wall had not merely been breached, it had been shattered beyond repair. June 7, 1944, dawned gray and threatening over Normandy as the second day of Operation Overlord began. The fragile beachheads established at such tremendous cost now faced their greatest test as German reinforcements converged on the invasion area. The success or failure of the entire Western European campaign hung in the balance during these crucial hours. General Omar Bradley surveyed the Omaha Beach sector from his command post, now finally established ashore after the previous day's near disaster. The beach that had been a charnel house 24 hours earlier was now a bustling logistics hub, with supplies and reinforcements flowing across the sand under the watchful eyes of beachmasters who had turned chaos into controlled activity. The German response finally began to materialize as dawn broke. General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann had assembled elements of several divisions for coordinated counterattacks against the Allied beachheads. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, composed largely of fanatical 17- and 18-year-old volunteers, moved toward the British sector despite constant harassment from Allied fighter bombers. Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, led his teenage soldiers into battle against Canadian forces near Caen. The Hitler Youth fought with suicidal bravery, their Panzer Mark IVs and assault guns engaging Canadian Shermans in running battles through the Norman villages. However, their inexperience showed as they took heavy casualties against the veteran desert rats. The artificial harbors, codenamed mulberries, began arriving off the Norman coast like floating cities. These massive engineering marvels would enable the Allies to land supplies directly onto the beaches at a rate that would eventually exceed the capacity of major ports. Phoenix caissons and floating roadways transformed the open beaches into protected harbors within days of the initial assault. Air Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory's Allied Expeditionary Air Force maintained complete dominance over the battlefield. German attempts to move reinforcements during daylight hours resulted in devastating losses to rocket-firing Typhoons and Thunderbolts. The Panzer Lehr Division, moving toward the invasion area, lost over 40 tanks and self-propelled guns to air attack before reaching the front lines. At Utah Beach, Major General Raymond Barton's 4th Infantry Division expanded the beachhead methodically, linking up with scattered elements of the 82nd Airborne Division. The capture of Sainte-Mère-Église by paratroopers had provided a crucial anchor point for the western flank of the invasion area. British forces at Gold Beach advanced toward Bayeux, which would become the first major French city liberated by the invasion forces. The 50th Infantry Division encountered stiffening German resistance as they moved inland, but their superior firepower and air support gradually overcame defensive positions that had been years in the making. The French civilian population's reaction to liberation varied dramatically across the invasion area. Some communities welcomed the Allies as liberators, while others viewed them as destroyers whose arrival brought only death and devastation to their ancient towns and villages. The bombing that preceded and accompanied the invasion had killed thousands of French civilians, creating complex emotions about the liberation. Rommel's arrival at his headquarters galvanized German defensive efforts, but the opportunity for a decisive counterattack had already passed. His Africa Corps veterans recognized the signs of a battle already lost. Allied material superiority was simply overwhelming. German ammunition shortages became critical as supply lines were severed by Allied air power and French resistance operations. The strategic implications of D-Day's success extended far beyond the Norman battlefield. Stalin's long-awaited Second Front had finally materialized, relieving pressure on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were preparing their summer offensive. Hitler now faced the nightmare scenario of major campaigns on two fronts, with diminishing resources to sustain both. By June 8th, the separate beachheads had expanded and linked into a continuous front stretching 60 miles along the Norman coast. Over 300,000 Allied troops were ashore with their equipment and supplies. The German army in the West would never again possess the strength to mount a serious threat to the Allied foothold in France. As documented in the official U.S. Army history, the success of Operation Overlord represented the culmination of industrial, technological, and military cooperation on an unprecedented scale. The liberation of Western Europe had begun on the beaches of Normandy, and the tide of World War II had turned irreversibly against Nazi Germany. The longest day had ended in victory, and the road to Berlin lay open before the Allied armies.